Today we're looking at dependent clauses. So a complex sentence will be any sentence with an independent clause and at least one dependent clause. In very complex sentences they'll have a large number of dependent clauses, subordinate clauses connected to the independent clause, and they may have more than one independent clause. But let's just focus on dependent clauses. There are a number of different types of dependent clauses, and if we learn a little bit more about them, it should help you once again with punctuation, because we're dealing here with the elements of a sentence, and in order to separate the elements with commas, we need to know which clause is which. Now don't worry about this information here, I'm going to come back to that at the end. Let's start with defining and non-defining relative clauses. If you want to know the difference between defining and non-defining, or restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses, please go to my lesson on relative clauses. I will link to it on this video, and I look at the difference. But just to remind you, I've got two examples here. Defining and non-defining relative clauses. They are adjective clauses. They are subordinate clauses. They're a type of dependent clause, and we call them adjective clauses because they modify a noun. So if we look at this first sentence, I'm meeting the man that I met yesterday. I'm meeting the man is the main clause. The subordinate clauses, which I will use the blue colour for, the subordinate clause is here. That I met yesterday cannot stand on its own. I'm meeting the man can stand on its own. It's got a subject, it's got a verb. There's our main clause, I'm meeting the man. But this that I met yesterday, it modifies a noun. It's an adjective clause because it modifies the man. Okay? And it's a defining clause because this is essential information for us to know who the man is. Again, if you're not sure about this, please watch my video on relative clauses. Now, the next one is a non-defining relative clause. And here we've got my doctor, who is also my friend. Here's the subordinate clause, who is also my friend. But the main clause would be just... Hold on, I'll find a black pen. The main clause is here. My doctor refused to see me. That's the main clause. And the subordinate clause is inside the main clause. And it's separated with commas because we have to do that with a non-defining relative clause. It has to be separated with commas. Okay, so there's our non-defining relative clause. And of course it's modifying the doctor. Yeah, the doctor, who is also my friend, refused to see me. Okay, that's defining and non-defining relative clauses done. Reduced relative clauses. Let's do those now. This is a reduced relative clause. The station, located in the town centre, is noisy. Now really, the station is noisy. That would be the main clause. The station is noisy. That can stand on its own. That's the independent clause. That's this part, yeah? But the reduced relative clause, which is dependent on the main clause, is here, located in the town centre. Now we call it a reduced relative clause because it's the station which is located in the town centre, or that is located in the town centre. In British English, which or that can be used for defining, but in American English I have read that only that can. So it all depends on whether you're using British English or American English. But here, the station, we've got the which is removed. That's why it's called a reduced relative clause. And located in the town centre, of course, it refers to the station. We don't need commas here because this is not non-defining. It's defining. This part defines which station. And so it's a defining relative clause. And so we don't use commas. Okay, the next example is of a participle clause. Now if we use a participle clause with there is or are, and also with the verbs see and hear, we very often have an adjective clause which modifies a noun. For example, there is a policeman talking to the driver. Now I hope you can all see already that this is the subordinate clause. And I hope you can see that it modifies once again the noun which it's touching. There is a policeman talking to the driver. I hope you also notice that we could say there is a policeman who is talking to the driver. So it's very similar to the reduced relative clause, and exactly the same for the next example. I can see a man looking at his watch. I can see a man who is looking at his watch. And so the subordinate clause modifies the noun in the main clause. Okay, so that's all of our adjective clauses where they're modifying a noun in the main clause. Let's now look at something a little bit different, which is subordinating conjunctions. And the reason why this is different is because we're now dealing with adverb clauses. These clauses modify the whole of the main clause, these adverb clauses. So what do I mean? Let's have a look. And if you want a whole list of these, please, there are lots of websites where you can find exhaustive lists of these conjunctions, because they are massive. There are lots and lots of conjunctions. So let's have some examples. I will do it if it's sunny. Here, now let's identify the subordinate clause again. The subordinate clause will be here, if it's sunny. Now if it's sunny, it refers to, it depends on the whole of the main clause. It's referring to all of this now, and not just, it's not just modifying the noun, it's modifying all of that clause. And so we call it an adverb clause. And please remember, if the main clause is first and then the subordinate clause comes second, no comma. If we swap this round, if we put if it's sunny, comma, I will do it, yes, we need a comma, because if we start with the subordinate clause, we have a comma after the subordinate clause before the main clause. However, if we start with the main clause, then we don't need a comma before the subordinate clause. So if we look at the next three examples, they all start with the subordinate clause. Let's have a look. Unless we work hard modifies the whole of this one. We won't pass the test. Yeah, it's not modifying the we, it's modifying the whole of the sentence, of the clause. It's modifying the whole of the main clause. And we need that comma because we start with a subordinate clause. Same again. Grinning from ear to ear, and now we're already on participle clauses. We've done subordinating conjunctions with unless and if. Now we're going to look at grinning from ear to ear. This is a participle phrase, actually. Some people will call this a phrase and not a clause because it doesn't have subject and verb. It just has subject, grinning from ear to ear. And for that reason, some people wouldn't call it a clause, but some people still call it subordinate clause. So let's just, I mean, it's very similar because it's modifying all of this clause. Okay, it's modifying the whole of I went to work. It means that these two actions happened at the same time. I was grinning from ear to ear while I went to work. That's really what it means. So grinning from ear to ear, I went to work. The same here, this is the subordinate conjunction, subordinate clause. We've got a comma because we've started with the clause, and it refers to all of this. Having finished my coffee, I paid and left. Okay, I hope that's all clear, that we can use these participle clauses too as subordinate clauses. And please remember that if we swap round the two clauses on this one or this one or this one, don't use a comma, because now you're starting with the main clause. So that should make commas a little bit easier, I hope. Now I need to say one more thing here, because there is something called sentential clauses, which are also adverb clauses. However, some grammar books don't consider them correct, and I've noticed that on the American syllabus, firstly they say in some of their some of the books that I've read, they say that is only for defining clauses and which is only for non-defining clauses. Now that's certainly not true in England. You can use that or which for defining and only which for non-defining. So it's different in the States and in the UK. And secondly, sentential clauses are not allowed in the GMAT exam, although I have heard that they are used regularly in the States. And a sentential clause is like this. I've got one example down here. The streets were crowded, which was unusual. Now, this is the subordinate clause, which was unusual, and which modifies the whole of the streets were crowded. It doesn't just modify crowded. So it's what we call a sentential relative clause. However, I'll remind you that this is not used in some exams. In some exams, which may only refer to a noun, and it may only be used in non-defining relative clauses. Let me just give you a quick example before we finish of what is possible in Britain but wouldn't be possible in America. Something like this. My brother suggested a TV show which suggested a book, or a TV show, doesn't really matter, suggested a book which was awful. Now, I think that the Americans are trying to get rid of ambiguity here with their rules, and I think they're actually quite right to do so, because this sentence, in England, we can use which for non-defining, but also for defining, and the only way you know if it's non-defining or defining in England is if there's a comma there or not. So here, my brother suggested a book which was awful. Here, this is a defining relative clause because there's no comma, and so it's the book which was awful, okay, which refers to the book. However, if I add a comma, which then no longer refers to the book, but it refers to the suggestion itself. It refers to the whole of the main clause then. So the comma suddenly makes the which a sentential clause. It makes it refer to the whole of the previous clause, and it changes the meaning, yeah? If you say my brother suggested a book, and the suggestion was awful, which was awful, it's different from my brother suggested an awful book. Okay, if you have any questions about any of this, please put them under the video. I know some of it's very confusing, but I hope that makes some things a little bit clearer. In the next class, we'll be looking at noun clauses, not adjective, not adverb clauses, but noun clauses, but still subordinate clauses. So we're going to look at this in quite a lot of detail. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, please put them under the video.